All right, welcome everyone. We thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon and joining us on our webinar. The title of our discussion today is Mastering Integration, Survey Results on Effective Digital Thread. So Razorleaf, along with our partner Tech Clarity, conducted a survey related to integration and digital thread. We want to share those results with you along with some observations on our feelings from what we saw in those results. As we go through the webinar, you're welcome to ask questions. If you come up with a question in the stream of the webinar, there's a question panel in GoToWebinar on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just type the question in there. For most of the questions, we'll wait to the end and we'll cover them. We've got a section of time set aside at the end to cover them. If I happen to see something in the question panel that's relevant and we need to talk about right now, I'll interrupt our presenters and I'll ask that question to them during that time. Of course, everything that we're doing today is going to be recorded. So anybody that is on the webinar today, anybody that was registered for the webinar will get a copy of this recording, and we'll provide that shortly after the recording is over. Today on the webinar, Razorleaf Corporation is joined by our friend Jim Brown from Tech Clarity. Jim, his organization, and I'll let Jim introduce himself in a second, does research around the PLM and the manufacturing space. And we partnered with Tech Clarity to get some information about how companies are integrating, what they're doing, what's working, what's not working, and we want to share that with you. Razorleaf, of course, is a digital thread consulting firm. We like to call ourselves a product agnostic consulting firm. So we help our customers implement the technologies, PLM, MES, integration technologies that help to build that digital thread. And so today we're joined with our chief architect, Jonathan Scott, who is one of the thought leaders of our organization. In fact, one of the thought leaders within the industry. So as I mentioned on the call today, we've got Jim Brown from Tech Clarity. We've got Jonathan Scott, our chief architect, and myself, Derek Neiding. I'm the vice president of business development at Razorleaf. So my job is to work with our clients and our prospects and try to understand what they're trying to do to automate their business and to try to make their business better. And so I get to hear what our customers are trying to do. I get to hear the solutions that our team is putting in place and how it's making those our clients successful. Jim, would you like to take just a second to introduce yourself and your organization?
Yeah, thank you, Derek. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. So Tech Clarity, we're an independent research firm. We really focus primarily on product innovation, product development, engineering, and manufacturing operations on into service, focusing really on industrial industries, the manufacturing industries. Our focus is really on the business value of technology. And we understand what the technology does, but we try and focus on how does it improve a manufacturer's business. And my role, I'm the founder and the president, but I also take an active role in researching digital innovation. So definitely PLM is a big part of that, but I've also got a background in other enterprise systems, ERP and supply chain, for example. So when we start talking about integration across the digital thread, I get excited because there's just so much value in the different areas. So look forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Jim. That experience will be valuable as we analyze these results. Jonathan Scott is the chief architect at Razorleaf Corporation. Jonathan, could you take a minute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, Derek. Thank you. So my name is Jonathan Scott, and my background is in engineering. I was a mechanical engineer for a while, working in a couple of different industries, and that's how I got into working in the software space and doing consulting. I was pretty excited about technology tools and what it could do for engineering and how we do that job and how people make products. So I got into the space 25 years ago, something like that. And I've been working with customers ever since, trying to implement the right technology to solve business problems. And that started with PDM systems. And I've worked with a bunch of different PDM and PLM systems, as well as other business systems, and integrating those, architecting those for clients to meet business needs. And so these days I spend a lot of time thinking about the problems that are challenging folks at the leading edge of product development, digital product development, and how to solve some of those problems. So I've seen quite a bit related to integration. I'm looking forward to talking about that topic and what we saw in the survey results today.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to hearing from you, Jonathan, and your experience in this space. So our agenda is pretty simple. We've kind of completed the introductions section of our agenda. We're going to start by asking Jim to share with us just kind of an overview of the findings from the survey. Throughout our discussion today, Jonathan is going to share with us some of the integration strategies that he has seen in industry, that he's seen work, that he's seen people attempt, that he's seen people talk about. So Jonathan's going to pepper some of those real world experiences as we go through the discussion. And as I mentioned, as we get to the end of the survey, we'll reserve some time for any questions that anybody would have. Feel free to enter those in the question panel at any time, and then we'll talk about those at the end. By the way, if we do run out of time and there are questions that we can't get to, we'll reply to individuals directly with our thoughts or our answers to your question. So I guess let's get right into it. And so we'll start, Jim, maybe you could kind of just help us to understand a little bit of the background about the research that was conducted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that, that we've seen, I mentioned that we really focus on the manufacturing industries, and we've got a lot of research done a lot of research on the digital thread and seen how much of a priority it is and how much it can drive business success and profitability. But at the same time, there's just this growing recognition that there really is no single centralized digital thread. There's no one system that's going to contain it. It's spread across an ecosystem of systems. So that's really, I think where we came together with Razorleaf and decided to look at this. So we conducted a survey, had over 100 respondents to it, analyzed it, and really tried to understand what are companies telling us? What are we hearing about the digital thread, but also about integrating?
Very good. So Jonathan, how about you, as you read the results of the survey, what are some of your observations about what we hope to get out of the survey?
Yeah, I think we want to understand where people are feeling challenged and where they're feeling some success, right? And what are the characteristics that they think are important to be successful? So, some of the questions that we put together help us understand where people are focused, what kind of problems they're trying to solve, where do they see the values, those sorts of things. So to me, we want to understand where it's working and where it's not in terms of people trying to build their own digital threads.
Perfect. Well, good. Well, that's what we'll try to get out of our discussion today. Like with any technical discussion, before we get too deep into it, we should all make sure that we have a common understanding, we're on the same page. So let's talk about some of the terminology that we're going to be using pretty heavily today. Jim, tell us about some of the definitions that we're going to rely on today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Derek. And as we do a survey, these are online surveys, so it's oftentimes really important to make sure that we spell out exactly what we're talking about. And I'm not going to read these to people, but the product digital thread really does a couple of things. It ties together information from across the product lifecycle, and it does that in a way that provides traceability, but also just creates this rich, this rich amount of knowledge about products and the product development process. And we wanted to differentiate an integrated digital thread from digital thread integration. Digital thread integration is about connecting that data. As I said before, there's this growing recognition that it's not all going to be in one place. So that there's data, there are applications that are, in many cases, an overused word, siloed, that need to be pulled together in order to have that cohesive product digital thread of information to provide that traceability. So we really just wanted to make sure that, we focus separately on what's the value of the digital thread, and then what's the value of integrating the digital thread across applications, across data and applications.
Okay, I'd like to jump in there if I could, Derek, and just supplement that to something Jim mentioned a few minutes ago when he mentioned it's not that digital thread is all in one system, right? And talking about integration, of course, just underscores that. But I think there's another point that may be obvious to some, but I don't know that it's obvious to everyone, which is there's also no single template for a digital thread, right? You could take two companies making the same kind of product in the same industry and ask each of them what kind of digital thread they'd like to build, and you'll get different answers, right? So the digital thread can be very unique, is very unique to an organization, and it takes into account things like their business model, their corporate culture, the IT systems they have, that kind of thing. So I just want people to have that in mind as we look at these results, that there really are no two digital threads that are the same. And that makes sense, right? That's logical. But I just wanted to highlight that while we're talking about the definition of it here.
Good information. That's important to keep in mind. Well, we're going to ask a few polls as we go through our survey today. So let's get to poll number one, which is, and so you should see a poll pop up on your screen. We'd really like it if everybody could answer. We talked to both IT people and others that are involved in the digital thread. And so we're curious as to who is in attendance today, so we get a little bit of idea of who that audience is. And this question really helps us kind of understand the diverse roles of people within an organization that are involved in the digital thread. Certainly, there's folks from IT that are involved from kind of an infrastructure and a setting it up perspective, and then there's people that are maybe more in the business side that are involved as being consumers. And both of those roles are very important, and all the roles in between as well. We want to make sure that these vital roles work together, that not only do we have the right technology, but that the technology is supporting the business process. And so, this question really kind of helps us to analyze, what is the perspective and what is the goal of those that we're talking to. All right, so we received most of our answers back, and I'll tell you that 25% of our attendees are from the IT or administration side. We're pretty spread equally for all of the other ones except for other, which has about 40% that are either other or here to learn. So that's good. This is the place to come if you are here to learn. So we appreciate you coming and joining us today. All right, with that, let's continue. And let's talk about why the digital thread is important. So Jim, what did you find that this participant said as to the importance of the digital thread?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I think it's important probably to reiterate a little bit of what Jonathan said a minute ago. I couldn't agree more that digital threads vary, and there's a lot of different things that companies may want to get out of their digital thread, but based on their business, their industry, what they're trying to accomplish. But we really did want to start with the business in mind, and what were companies really trying to achieve through their digital thread initiatives. And you see over 2/3 right off the bat, product quality, and that's a very common very common response that we find when we ask about the digital thread. But it also, you see that it creates this rich environment where you can have better decision making. You've got this knowledge base that people can get to information about different aspects of a product in one place in a cohesive way with managed relationships. And it also helps sort of operationally to streamline product development. So faster time to market, product development efficiency, obviously those two, and engineering efficiency even, those three really are interrelated, to help drive products to market faster, which in turn drives higher levels of profitability and market share. So that's why I think that we think this topic is so incredibly important to not just engineering, but to overall business success.
And I think, Jim, there's when we look at the different goals, it's easy to sort of look at data like this and say, well, yeah, I could see where product quality is important to more of the respondents. That's what they're focused on. But what I see is that most people are focused on multiples of these in some way or another. Not everything, but these numbers, I think, bear that out. I'll give you an example of what I mean. What I would consider maybe a somewhat non-traditional digital thread, but one of our customers, one of the armed services branches, their goal for putting a digital thread in place was really twofold, right? And when we helped them build one out and put some integrations in place to tie PLM to some other downstream systems, it was number one, so they could make better decisions with more information while that weapon system was being delivered, right? So again, keep in mind, they weren't designing it, somebody else was, but nonetheless, they put a digital thread in place on their side to start receiving that data to contribute to the definition of the product. But then number two, so they could receive the data as it became available to improve service. So down at the tail end of the chart down there, right? So they were at the front end trying to improve product quality of the product that got delivered to them and do better decision making in those requirements. But then it improved service on the tail end once they received that product. So I think it's interesting. It goes back to that point about digital threads are unique to each organization based on their objectives. What are they trying to do with it? But this to me says a lot.
Yeah, that's a good observation, Jonathan. Thanks for bringing up that real world example that you have seen. Let's talk about so the purpose was discussed. Let's talk about the value or the importance of that digital thread. So Jim, you had mentioned earlier about that single source of truth, and having multiple systems but yet needing a single source of truth. How does that impact the need for integrations?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we really asked about, how important is integration and to achieving digital thread goals. And, you see that, actually, Jonathan, I love you pointed out the piece that people don't see in the other chart, that means people are focused on multiple things, which is great. The thing that actually drives the most interest to me in this chart is the little asterisk at the bottom that said nobody out of the survey said that integration is not important to achieving their digital thread goals, which you rarely see 100% or 0% in any survey. It just is a rare thing. So what you see then is basically 2/3 are saying that it's either important or critical. And another third say that it's nice to have. It's definitely something that is good to have around. But what we think is that we're seeing it become even more critical than before, because we're seeing a lot more solutions available. Some of them are on the cloud. People are using more point solutions and not just going to the one single platform. Recognizing that they need maybe a different simulation tool, maybe they need a different application that's something that helps in a very specific role or task that gathers information about a simulation or about something in manufacturing. So we're seeing this expansion of more solutions, but we're also seeing an expansion of more disciplines, more engineering disciplines. As Jonathan mentioned, the weapon systems, but also automotives. Everything has just got so much more complicated in terms of mechanical, electrical, software, and really needs to be looked at that systems level. And when you're trying to look at something at that systems level, those relationships and keeping everything cohesive is so much more difficult, but B, important.
Good, very nice. Thanks for sharing that with us. Let's
Can
I'm
I
sorry,
add one more
Jonathan.
thing there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think an example of what Jim was talking about is important there. Why so many people think it's important, right? I mean, we're all spoiled by the kinds of data we have at our fingertips today with cell phones and that sort of thing. And I think this answer is being driven a bit by people knowing what the art of the possible is, right? That, wait, I can have that information at my fingertips when I'm making decisions. And so if I can, it's important to have it, right? To have that context. And I'll give you a simple example. The kind of integration we've seen for years before even digital thread was a concept and a term is connecting PLM to ERP. Simple example here. People are doing an engineering change process and they're trying to decide, what do I do with the parts I've already made? And knowing how many of those parts you have in inventory is helpful information. Well, years ago, it was as simple as that was a step in the engineering change process. You'd ask someone, in materials control, in purchasing, somewhere, to check the inventory on the part, bring that to the discussion. or check it and maybe stop the change process if there was a problem and you were going to scrap too many parts. But now that we all realize that information could be available to everyone through integration, you put it up front, right? You get like the inventory from the ERP system integrated and shown in the PLM or the product development system, so the designer proposing the change knows before they even spend the first minute doing a redesign, oh, we've got $7 million in inventory. We need to rework those parts, not scrap and redesign them. Okay, right? But that's that kind of contextual view that people want. And now that we realize we can have it, I think that's what gets us to this kind of result where everybody realizes it's got some level of importance.
So, Jonathan, I'm going to ask you, and Jim, you can answer as well, a little bit of an off-script question here. Previously, 69% of the people said that product quality was important to their digital thread. 55% said it helped them with better decision-making, faster time to market. But 31% here say that it's just a nice to have. Why would 31%, nearly a third of the people, say it's just a nice to have if all those other things are true? Jonathan, do you think they don't know it's possible? Do you think it's maybe the industry they're in, it really is just a nice to have? The product that they make doesn't require that? Any observations on why there may be a decent number of people saying that it's just a nice to have?
I think it's the trick is what they're conceptualizing when they answer the question, right? Because for folks who have a clear and pressing need and a pain point today, I think you see them in the red and the blue here. And for folks who are thinking about a case, but maybe they don't see how it connects to the business, that's where you're seeing the green. That's my take, but that's just an opinion.
Jim, anything to add to that, or do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, well, I definitely agree with it, but I would also add that I think some people may still be thinking, all right, my digital thread is in my PLM system. I've got my engineering data in one place, and they've invested in that, and it's very valuable. But now we're starting to see people really trying to do more and work downstream. So, we've actually done some research on extending the digital thread to service, or even to the operational life of a piece of equipment. And when you start looking at extending beyond engineering and you start looking at the digital thread and understanding operational data of a piece of equipment, for example, that's never going to be in one system. So I think a lot of it probably does depend on the goals that they have for their digital thread. If they have relatively compact goals and they've invested in an integrated PLM system that pulls a lot of information together, they may be in pretty good shape. It might be nice to have that inventory. Other people are saying, hey, no, that's absolutely critical because we want to have IoT data associated back so our engineers can see it.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for sharing those thoughts, guys. So we have another survey question that we want to get to. How integrated is your company's data and applications across the product digital thread? So we'd like everyone to share their observations or their thoughts related to that. As we think about that digital thread, we like to know kind of where people stand today. Much of our research, as you'll find out, if you've seen so far, you'll find out as we continue, seems to indicate that people are kind of early in that stage. This can lead to data still staying siloed and not super available to other departments. But I think what we're seeing is as people find, Jim kind of touched on this, is they find as they have more awareness about the possibilities of integration, they're starting to make it a little bit more important, making it something that they're really trying to work on. So curious as to what you guys the audience is experiencing in their real world. So from that, our survey results show as follows, just two categories. A very small percentage, around 10%, said that they are very little integrated, and 83% said that they are somewhat integrated. So that doesn't surprise us that there is some level of integration going on for most people, although maybe not to the point that they want to get to. So as we kind of look at this next slide, when we ask about the progress that companies have made to date, Jonathan, what do you think about both the survey results and what you see up here from the research?
Yeah, what I see is much like our poll just showed and this shows, a lot of people may have an integration, right? And they integrated something that was a specific pain point. So I think there's progress, but it feels like to me it's not the progress that most people want. And they're not doing it necessarily in an optimized way. And my observation from our customers, what I see is a lot of them have done a point-to-point type of integration, right? Along the lines of the example I gave earlier. I want to see some ERP data in PLM and I want to surface it there so people have more information for decision making. Or maybe the reverse direction. I want a bill of material to be sent to my downstream system like ERP or MES so it can be acted upon, that kind of thing. But those point-to-point solutions really aren't scalable when you start thinking about a digital thread across multiple systems and you're trying to bring the real context of the product into view for anybody in any of those systems. So, that's what I see is people are taking baby steps, but it's not always with a holistic integration strategy in mind. They're not necessarily thinking about digital thread. They're thinking, oh, I just need that piece of data over here. I need to see it over there, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, Jim, I think this slide goes back to that point you made earlier when I asked the question about why 31% of people said that maybe integration was just a nice to have. And this slide, 98% of people have some level of integration. Only 2% say that they're not integrated. So I think you're probably right in what you said about the 31%, that they probably have their data already integrated or in a single system. So that's kind of their integration, is that single system, because it would seem contradictory that 31% would say that it's a nice to have, but meanwhile 98% are doing some level of integration. So I think that observation that you made on the previous slide was probably accurate. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
No, I was just going to say the biggest thing that I took away from that chart and the previous chart was just the disconnect, right? I mean, we see how important the digital thread is. We see how critical integration is, and then you see 2/3 only have some integration. It's just there's a long way to go.
Right. So good segue into this slide. What are the impacts when we're not where we want to be or need to be? What are the impacts? What did the survey find?
Yeah, and we looked at impacts in a few different ways, but one of them was just sort of operationally on a day-to-day basis. How can you tell that your digital thread is not up to par in terms of integration? And so we looked at things like how often do companies have to enter, or how often do people have to put data into multiple systems that's the same thing, or how often do they have to retrieve data from multiple systems to do a task? And then in those cases when they have multiple systems that maybe have the same data, how often do they have errors and inconsistencies? And you see that this is not something that happens just occasionally for most companies, right? It's a daily or a weekly occurrence for most companies, that they have these challenges, right? And whether you call it swivel chair integration, for example, the amount of inefficiency that comes in here when you think about the importance of time to market, and that the digital thread can drive engineering and product development efficiency, is pretty significant. But then you think about the mistakes, right? When people have to look at different places for information and they maybe are getting conflicting results, that's where mistakes and rework come in that really throw off time, but also quality, cost, and really throw off customer trust.
Interesting. So Jonathan, how about you apply some of your real world observations? So the survey said this. Is this what you see as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the frequency is one part, and the impact when some of these problems happen is another part that is, it's hard to look at in the survey, right? So it wasn't necessarily something we dug into, but I think it's important to think about when you see these results, and what Jim just noted, that by and large, nobody's having this happen occasionally. There's some regularity to these problems, right? So, but I'll give you a case in point of a problem, because I think it highlights what we're getting to in the survey question, that this isn't necessarily about not having an integration, but not having the robust digital thread integration that you need, right? So maybe your integration doesn't operate well or isn't really fit for purpose exactly. So the example I'll give is a customer I worked with a while back. This wasn't even necessarily a true digital thread, but they connected their PDM to a downstream enterprise document management system. So that's how lots of the organization got to that technical data. And the error and inconsistency event that they had was quite significant, right? It was a CAD drawing that procurement used the PDF that came out of that enterprise document management system to get to the supplier or the vendor who made this component. They were a big service company. They made large pieces of capital tooling to do their service work. So this one piece of tooling was like $100,000 piece of tooling, and because the integration that they put in place really didn't understand kind of the nature of the data that was being integrated, and namely that CAD data needed to be refreshed before it was published to a PDF. That's what they were kind of missing with the technical integration. What they ended up with was purchasing sent a PDF with out-of-date CAD information to the vendor. The vendor cut this piece of tooling too short, and it was a large assembly of metal. It was a large weldment, and it ended up being tens of thousands of dollars of rework. And they had to go through the process of hunting down where was the problem? Why was this an issue? Did the vendor have the wrong drawing? All of that sort of thing. And they found the root cause was, well, our integration just didn't do things in quite the right order, and there wasn't a CAD update before you went to PDF. So I tell the story because it points out the poor digital thread integration piece of this question, right? It's not necessarily examples of not having an integration, but when you do it, you have to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Interesting. So if we're sharing examples of errors causing tens of thousands of dollars worth of cost, it begs the question, if this integration is so important, why are there still so many issues? Why haven't companies done more? Jim, what are your observations of that?
Yeah, well, I think the one chart definitely showed, that there's a lot of work left to do in terms of integration to really get things pulled together properly. But it's just hard. I mean, if you think about integration, and I think we have a fair number of IT people on the call today. From a technical perspective, integration has gotten a bit easier. We used to have to worry about data formats that were entirely incompatible, and we don't really have to deal with some of those things like working on a mainframe anymore. So technically some things have gotten easier, but the semantic challenges of pulling information together, and the challenges of actually having something that fits into a business context and a workflow have gotten much more complex. And so we looked at actually 4 different areas of challenges. Challenges in implementation, which is part of the issue. But as Razorleaf knows very well, it's also about the operation and the maintenance, right? That's where, just getting it in the first place, especially if you don't do it in a robust way the first time around when you implement it, operation and maintenance start to become real challenges. And actually, the ebook has some details on all of these. I don't think we have time to go into them today, as well as business challenges. So definitely just a lot of hurdles to get over.
And Jonathan, what about your thoughts on why companies haven't done more with this being so important?
I would echo what Jim said. I mean, I think it can be a bit like a mirage off in the distance. You see it, it's important, you go after it, and when you get there, it looks a lot different, or it's gone, it's moved. It's hard to nail down exactly what you want and how you're going to do it. And as Jim noted, a lot of things have changed about this. The challenges that we expected with technical integration 10, 20, 30 years ago, those aren't the challenges. Now there's something different. So I think that has a lot to do with why it's tough.
Good. Jim, you touched on some of the things that make it tough, so we want to put up a poll question. Our last poll question, so we'd like to hear what the audience has to say about this. What does your company have the most challenges in integrating their product across the digital thread? So is it in the implementation? You're fine, you get things implemented fine, it's just kind of the operation of it, some of those scenarios that Jonathan talked about the PDM system integrated with the document management system, or is it the ongoing maintenance, the fact that there's so many systems that are connected together? We're curious as to what people are seeing. 80% of our respondents said that they have some level of integration. So with that some level that you have, tell us where you run into challenges. And so the results are still coming in, but interestingly, there's only two answers. 75% of the people have said that their problem is with implementation, just getting it up and running. And well, the numbers are changing a little bit, but it's still just two answers: implementation and then all of the above. So that I don't think that that's surprising that there's where people are having the challenges. As we talk a little bit further in the survey and we get into what some of the leaders are doing, I think you'll see that they too experience challenges in these areas as well. So let's get into that. Let's talk about some of the top performers. And surveys are always interesting when you can pull out the top performers. And so when we look at some of these companies that do things better than others, Jim, what do you have to say about the benchmarking that we see in this slide?
Yeah, so we used our performance banding process. It's as you said, it's a benchmarking process, and what we do is we pick some metrics that are important to our particular topic, and in this case, we look directly at the effectiveness of their product digital thread integration, and asked a series of questions, and then ranked people, and ended up taking the top quartile, the top 25% of the respondents that said they had the most effective product digital thread integration. And then what we were able to do with that is to look at what are they doing differently to see what tends to work. And usually we primarily look at what tools are they using or what processes they're using to find best practices. But actually the interesting thing is this chart on the right showed us something that was really interesting, is that those companies that really were doing the best job, had the most effective capabilities for integration, also have just much broader scope of integration, four times more likely to say that they've got significant integration across data and applications in their product digital thread. And if you look over at the supply chain, where they've got integration at the enterprise or value chain level, as opposed to just maybe a departmental level, like we talked about, companies that maybe are just integrated within engineering, we see the same thing. It's roughly a 4x difference in terms of the level of integration that these top performers have. So it's interesting that there's just this correlation between those that are good at it have just done a lot more. And maybe it's a chicken and egg scenario. They've done it a lot, so they're very good at it. It doesn't really matter. I think the key point is there are companies that do better, and they're getting a lot more value from it.
I think that chicken and the eggs observation is spot on, Jim. My feeling from some of the customers we work with that really seem to embrace integration and have success with it is that those two things are correlated. Those who embrace it seem to have success with it, and I think there's also a timing element too, right? So the clients that I see who put integration front and center in their technology deployment project, right, and don't look at it as, oh, I'm putting PLM in place, it's going to do everything I need, but rather look at it as, wait, this is part of a larger context that I'm deploying here. So integration is an integral part of that. They don't leave it till the end or an afterthought or a later phase. Those folks seem to do more of it, in my experience. They recognize the value of it sooner, the organization does, and that sort of builds the momentum to say, well, that worked, but we didn't go integrate it here, but we could, and it would benefit us, and look how well that other one worked, right? So it is a chicken and egg thing, I think, too.
So Jonathan, I want to ask you again another question that's a little bit off script, but that point you made about it having the integration mindset kind of be part of the PLM rollout, for example. So did I understand that right? So what you're saying is that when implementing one of these major business systems, that you should not only say, what do we need to do to implement the system, but you should also at that point be thinking about how you're going to integrate that system with the other major systems in the company.
I think that's right. I mean, this has a lot to do with our philosophy on doing technology projects like this in the first place, right? So I don't want to wax too philosophical, but in my mind, you're not deploying a PLM system or an MES system, just because you need to deploy that. you're deploying it to support your business and your business processes, and you're likely going to change your business processes as a result. And it's rare that your business processes all work just inside of one system. Sometimes departmental ones do, but the overall enterprise flow typically goes across systems. So if you're really thinking about implementing a changed business process, then you're going to have to think about, well, how does it work across PLM, MES, ERP, the various systems, and integration becomes critical to that. So it's what your focus is on a project. Are you just trying to deploy a system, or are you trying to implement some kind of change or transformation in your business that requires integration as part of it? So to me, it's a little bit philosophical.
So is it fair then to make the assumption that if you took that approach, if you thought about integration when you're implementing one of those major systems, that you may also then implement the system in a way that makes it conducive for integration?
I think that's right. This is a Stephen Covey thing I'm stealing here, but begin with the end in mind, right? So if you have that end goal in mind, that transformed process, you'll think about all of it differently, right? Maybe how I need to change my ERP, even if you're not in the middle of an ERP project, but how do I need to deploy my PLM? How do I need to change my ERP? And how do I need to integrate the two to solve the business problem?
Good, very good. Thank you for sharing that. So looking back, Jim, at the top performers, we talked earlier about the dangers of not having a good integration strategy. What do the top performers see now that they have a good integration strategy?
Yeah, no. So those that those top performers that really are more, have more effective integration capabilities. It's interesting to see that their scope of integration is so much broader. But then you see here's where the rubber hits the road, right? They're about half as likely to have to enter data more than once on a daily basis, right? They are I don't know, about a quarter is likely to have to go to multiple systems to find data. And on through here, all of the challenges that we looked at, do they have issues where data is not timely? Are they losing data? Do they have to manually gather data for other people? It's one of the challenges for engineers is, for people downstream for a design review or for product documentation. Do they have to pull information together for somebody else and, take non-value added time out of innovation and engineering? In all of those different areas, we saw that those companies with better integration capability, those top performers, really suffer less from those challenges.
Interesting. Jonathan, any observations on this data?
I think it's correlated to something else. It was difficult, I think, for us to pull out of a survey, but my anecdotal observation is the top performers have a strategy, right? It's not a, I got to go do this thing and they do it as part of their project or a follow-on, like I was saying earlier, but it was an integral part of what they were trying to implement with a process change or whatever they were doing. And so it influences a number of these areas, which makes them successful at multiples, right? It's, I've got to have a hub and spoke type of integration because I got 4 systems to tie together to really get the result that I want. So I'm thinking about data governance up front. I'm thinking about master data management up front, and I've got a strategy, not, let me put a Band-Aid on that one, let me put a Band-Aid on that one, that sort of thing. So to me, that's correlated here.
Good, very good. So what are they doing? What are the top performers doing? And one of the things that we learned from past surveys, Jim, was that when you did some of this benchmarking process against the top performers, is that the leading companies do things differently. What did you find out with regard to leading companies related to the digital thread?
Yeah, Derek, and it's interesting. We do a lot of these surveys on different topics, and sometimes you see just really clear results that say, companies that have faster time to market are 4 times more likely to, collaborate around 3D data or something like that. You just see these real smoking guns. And this one is really a little bit different because you definitely see that the top performers are a little bit more likely to take a number of different approaches. So you can't really say that, oh, well, adapters and connectors or event triggers or using an integration platform, like any one of these things is they all show that top performers use them a little bit more, but they use all of them a little bit more. And what that really made us do is, and I really appreciated some of the insights actually from Razorleaf on this, from your practical experiences. There is no one way, right? I mean, it really was a conversation about the top performers take a variety of approaches, right? They have a bigger toolkit to integrate, because there's different needs and different scenarios, and depending on what they want to do across that broader scope of integration, they may need to do it differently in one case than they do in the next. So
Jonathan, are we seeing that even within a single organization, that with a single integration strategy, that they take different approaches to integrate different kinds of data?
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think I'll give you a couple of data points here. One, it may be obvious to some of the IT folks on the call, is that digital thread kind of integration is just fundamentally different from the kinds of integrations you might do with an ERP system on transactions, right? So record-based integration and transaction-based integration are very different animals, and you need different techniques and toolkits for them. That's one example. But let me answer your question and touch on this data at the same time. Like Jim mentioned, I think the top performers they're out chasing the sort of front line of digital thread and product digitalization today. They're doing things like model-based enterprise, or they're trying to get there, right? So let me give you a concrete example of where you need multiple integration approaches to get where you want to go. So let's say model-based enterprise is what you're pushing, right? You're trying to get that approach between engineering and manufacturing to be paperless on the shop floor and use models instead of drawings for clear communication. To accomplish that kind of PLM to MES integration, you need to share 3D models, which can be large, multi-file collections of data. And you might need an integration platform to support this kind of integration, for example, because you are sharing files, maybe not passing them back and forth, that kind of thing. And another thing you need to accomplish with this is a bidirectional link that is event-driven, right? So hopefully you can hear, as I'm describing this, I'm kind of picking off several of these approaches that need to come together just in a single integration between a PLM and an MES, right? So for instance, when a new model's released, it's an event-based thing. You need to share that down to the other system or to the platform so it can be accessed. But then in the MES system, when a discrepancy is discovered on the shop floor, you need to tie that back to PLM to start a change process. But another example here, this data, you got to understand the nature of that data, because you need to do this based on the features inside of a 3D CAD file, right? And that requires knowing the unique feature ID inside of CAD data, which means understanding the CAD APIs and really getting into the depths of what you're doing. So touching on another one, standard APIs, right? So you have to pull all these things together and understand the nature of that data to get an effective integration. And I think that's why we see top performers doing it. They have to, right? They can't accomplish what they're trying to without using multiple techniques and tools.
Very good. Well, my job is to keep us on time, and so let's continue to move forward. As we go to our last slide here and we look at some of the things that the top performers have done to reduce the barriers to integration. Jonathan, what do you note about this information?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense, right? That lots of folks see this as too expensive and it taking too long. And that to me just adds up to the last one about hard to justify and prove the ROI. And I think there's something behind this, at least from the conversations I have with customers very often. And I don't mean to stereotype customers, but it just happens a lot. We'll get into the conversation about integration, and the starting point for a lot of folks is, well, we have an integration platform, right? We've got Boomi or Tibco or MuleSoft or something like that. We'll just tie this and that system together. We've got a group that does that. Don't worry, we got that under control. The reality is that really never seems to work very well, because the nature of this data. And this is where we get to the too expensive takes too long part, is as we dig into it, the group that maybe does integration inside the business says, well, wait a minute, this product data doesn't look like a lot of the other data in the organization that we've been integrating. It's the point I made earlier about transaction data versus record data. And this record data can look very unique, a lot of different shapes and behaviors to it that you need to take into account. So once those technologists kind of start peeling back the layers of the onion and see that, they realize how much work needs to be done to understand the nature of that data and the behavior of that integration. And suddenly the cost goes up. What looked like, hey, we've got a platform, we just lather, rinse, repeat, kind of do the same integration again, but just to this other system, doesn't look like that at all, right? And now it looks like a large, long project, and you get these kinds of results. I think the folks, the top performers, what they're seeing is they kind of went in with eyes wide open already. Maybe they recognized it, and they already had sort of purpose-built tools, or tools that understood the kind of product data they're working with. And so the problem looks different to them, right? So that's what I see.
Interesting. Jim, does that resonate with you and what you saw in the survey results?
Yeah, it does. And, it's interesting. We usually don't publish a lot about the challenges that top performers have versus others. Those top 25% oftentimes face the same challenges that the others do, but they've overcome them and maybe in a different way with different capabilities, different best practices, or different technologies. The interesting thing here is that these sort of business-oriented ones, these ones about, are you getting started, or are you able to accomplish it from a business and investment perspective? The top performers, I think, have lowered the barrier to entry through some better capabilities, and so it really gives them the way to leapfrog and continue to do more and more. And so I think the overall takeaway of it is, those companies that have really invested in getting good at the discipline of integration are able to do more, and because they've done more, they've got lower barriers to entry to continue to do more. So it just tells me more and more that companies have to make this a discipline that's important to them, and do it specifically to the product digital thread, because as Jonathan's saying, the data is just different.
Very good. Excellent. Well, guys, that kind of gets us towards the end here. So let's cover a couple of the highlights, I think, that we came up with as we went through our analysis of the survey results. I think it's clear that most agree that there's value in integrating the data across the enterprise. I mean, that's not something that most people argue with, but we also recognize that everybody kind of defines their digital thread, or maybe we'll say the fidelity of their digital thread, a little differently. And so that can impact your strategy. I mean, a company that's making refrigerators has a different digital thread need than a company that's making jet airplane engines. And so that's something that each organization needs to look at and consider as they try to lay out their strategy, is really what do they need, and how deep do they need it to be. We also, I think, learned that there's really no silver bullet out there. In fact, when we looked at the slide that talked about what some of the top performers are doing, we saw 6 or 8 different approaches that they're taking, even within the same organization, because they have different needs for their digital thread in that organization. And then the point that I think was my favorite was the point that Jonathan made about starting with the end in mind, that we don't just simply implement the system, PLM, MES, ERP, whatever the system may be, and then come back later and say, hey, we should integrate these. Instead, as we're laying out the implementation of those major systems, we should be thinking about how they're going to need to integrate in order to have those robust business processes that we're looking to have. So those are some of the key insights and highlights that I took away. We do have time for just a couple questions. I'll go to this one first, because this one popped up. Jim, earlier you mentioned, we were looking at that slide about whether it's important, not important, nice to have. You mentioned that some believe that their PLM system just should have everything. Isn't that my digital thread? So we had a couple questions that came in related to that. So how would you answer that, Jim? And then we'll go to Jonathan. Shouldn't the PLM system shouldn't it just have digital thread data? Why integrate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And, I think if you asked me 10 years ago, what I was seeing in the different companies, manufacturers that we talked to and in the surveys, what we would see is that people had this goal that PLM was going to be everything, and and that all of the information that they needed would be in one system, and it would all be sort of integrated as PLM is the sole source of truth. And I think that sole source of truth is really, it's like that oasis, it's like that mirage that you can never get to, because there's just more and more data coming in that needs to be connected, that needs to be considered. And the companies that are really pushing the edges of innovation and pushing the edges of product development are doing things like gathering performance data off of equipment and sharing that with engineers so they can build the next version better, right? And the boundaries keep expanding. So there is no one system, PLM or anything, that's going to have everything anymore, but you need to have an integrated view across that information, even if it's in multiple systems.
So Jonathan, in 1 minute, what do you think? Do you agree with that?
Huh. I do. I think it has something to do with the nature of the problem, right? Which is, you can use the example of the major players in PLM today. Each of those major vendors is doing a great job of expanding the PLM footprint and adding a lot of the content that Jim just talked about. But as they do, it makes their very large platform hard to be nimble and agile and adapt to the next thing that comes out, right? So the better the big platform gets at housing all that data, the harder it is to adapt to accept that next piece that's the new one on the horizon, right? So I think it's just the nature of the problem that you shouldn't expect for a complex issue like a product digital thread to all be solved by one system. Because if you try to put it all in there, you may be waiting until that's matured in one of those huge vendors before you can do it, and that may be too late. So I agree. I think it's an intractable problem, and you'll always need integration.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. Well, we need to wrap up. I want to thank both Jim and Jonathan for joining us and kind of analyzing and going through the survey. Everyone that attended the webinar will get both a link to this recording as well as a copy of the survey. We encourage you to go through it, read it. There's things in there that we just didn't have the time or the cycles to talk about today. And we want to keep the dialogue open. So feel free to talk with us, talk with Jim, as you have questions or observations about the survey, and share this within your organization. Get the feedback and input from those around you about whether or not this is what they're seeing and this is what they believe. One other point I would like to mention is that we're going to continue this discussion soon on the Razorleaf podcast. So Razorleaf has a weekly podcast called Stay Sharp. You can get it on all the podcast platforms that you're familiar with. You can see a link to it on our website. Jonathan and Jim will be continuing this conversation in the coming weeks about this integration survey and their observations, a little more casual, a little more free-flowing of a discussion that they'll have then. So for now, we thank you for joining us, and we encourage you to reach out to Razorleaf or Tech Clarity should you have any questions or comments, or there's anything that we can help you with. And so again, thanks for joining. Thank you, Jim and Jonathan, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.